Today, we're embarking on a truly fascinating historical investigation of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. We're actually going to move completely past the theology for a moment and look strictly at the hard historical evidence. We're acting as historical detectives today to see exactly where the data leads us. Now, I know what you might be thinking. How can we possibly analyze ancient claims of a miracle today? It sounds like something that has to be purely based on faith, right? But what's really fascinating is that we absolutely can investigate this by applying rigorous historical, psychological, and even medical standards. We're going to look at the bedrock facts that almost all scholars agree on, regardless of their personal religious beliefs. To get to the bottom of this, we're going to walk through 6 key steps, starting with the minimal facts approach, establishing the medical certainty of death, investigating the empty tomb, diving into the radical transformations of the witnesses, testing the alternative theories, and finally, arriving at our best historical explanation. Section 1. The minimal facts approach. We are building our case on academic bedrock. So what does this actually mean? Well, instead of just assuming ancient texts are flawlessly inspired, scholars like Gary Habermas and Michael Licona use what's called the minimal facts method. We're literally only looking at data that is so strongly backed by evidence that even the most skeptical, highly critical secular historians agree, yep, that definitely happened. And that brings us to our starting point. These 5 historical facts form the bedrock of our investigation. Fact 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, his disciples had experiences they genuinely believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. 3, the completely radical conversion of Saul, who was a violent persecutor of the early church. 4, the conversion of James, the highly skeptical brother of Jesus. And 5, which is accepted by an overwhelming majority of scholars, the tomb of Jesus was found empty. Any valid historical theory has to be able to explain these 5 things. All right, moving to section 2, the certainty of death, where we'll look at the medical realities of the crucifixion. This isn't just ancient history. We actually have a highly detailed, peer-reviewed medical analysis published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And the sequence of events they lay out guarantees a complete physical collapse. It starts with extreme emotional distress causing hematidrosis, literally sweating blood. Then severe Roman scourging causes massive blood loss, throwing the victim into a critical pre-shock state before they even reach the cross. Finally, the execution itself ensures death by asphyxiation and heart failure. This completely crushes what's known as the swoon theory. You know, the idea that Jesus didn't actually die, but just passed out on the cross and woke up later in a cool, damp tomb. Modern medical science makes it crystal clear. The severe trauma, the immense blood loss, and that pre-shock state made surviving a Roman crucifixion and then waking up in a sealed stone tomb an absolute physical impossibility. He was definitively dead. Section 3, the empty tomb. Let's check out the scene of the crime. So, we have multiple independent lines of historical evidence pointing to the fact that the tomb really was empty. For starters, the first day of the week tradition goes back to the absolute earliest years of the movement. But here's the real kicker, the criterion of embarrassment. All 4 Gospels report that women were the first to discover the empty tomb. Now, in first-century Jewish culture, women unfortunately had a very low social status and weren't considered reliable legal witnesses. Think about it. If you're making up a story to convince the ancient world, you would never, ever invent women as your primary witnesses. On top of that, the earliest counter-argument from critics was that the disciples stole the body, which tacitly admits the body was actually missing. And those grave clothes left behind? Come on, grave robbers are in a massive hurry. They don't take the time to unwrap a body and neatly fold the linens before taking off. Renowned historian N.T. Wright hits the nail on the head here. Context is absolutely everything. In first-century Judaism, a resurrection wasn't some spiritual vision or a spooky ghost story. The original Greek and Hebrew words strictly meant a physical, grave-emptying, bodily event. A resurrection without an empty tomb would be as meaningless to them as a square circle. Moving on to section 4, radical transformations. We're going from hostile skeptics to martyrs. This is one of the most fascinating pieces of the puzzle, the dramatic 180 of Paul's life. On one side, you have Saul of Tarsus, the early church's absolute worst enemy. He was a violent persecutor acting with zero inner guilt. But then he completely transforms into Paul the martyr, arguably the greatest missionary in Christian history. He claimed this radical paradigm shift happened for one specific reason. He directly encountered the physically resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus. And we see an equally monumental shift with James. During Jesus' earthly life, his own half-brother James was a total skeptic. The texts literally tell us his family thought he was out of his mind. Yet right after the crucifixion, James suddenly becomes this prominent leader of the early church in Jerusalem. Paul tells us the risen Jesus appeared specifically to James. We even know from the secular Jewish historian Josephus that James was eventually stoned to death for this exact belief. These weren't gullible followers expecting a miracle. They were actively hostile skeptics. Which brings us to the ultimate proof of their sincerity. Almost all the apostles faced intense persecution, torture, and eventual martyrdom. As historian Sean McDowell's research demonstrates, they willingly died for this conviction. And here's the crucial point. People might die for a lie that they mistakenly think is true, but they will never ever willingly endure torture for a lie they know they just invented, and not a single one of them ever recanted. They truly believed they had seen the risen Jesus. Section 5. Testing alternative theories. Let's put the naturalistic explanations on trial. It's super interesting how every major naturalistic theory just totally collapses under the weight of modern data. Take mass hallucination, the most popular one today. Clinical psychologists universally agree that hallucinations are private, individual events. A whole group of people cannot share the exact same subjective vision, any more than they can share the exact same dream. What about conversion disorder to explain Paul? Well, psychiatrists note that Paul and James completely lacked the typical psychological profile for that malady. They had no inner guilt or subconscious desire to convert whatsoever. And the stolen body theory? Like we mentioned, it doesn't explain the neatly left grave clothes, and it certainly doesn't give the disciples a motive to die for a massive hoax. If we dig a little deeper into the psychology of hallucinations, we know they require expectation and emotional excitement. But the disciples, they were in a state of utter despair and fear. They were literally hiding in a locked room. Plus, Jesus reportedly appeared to varied groups in totally different mindsets, both insides and outsides. But here is the absolute biggest fatal flaw. A hallucination is just a trick of the mind. Hallucination definitely does not roll away a heavy stone and empty a physical grave just outside the city walls. If this was just a mass hallucination, the authorities could have easily marched over to the tomb, pulled out the body, paraded it through the streets of Jerusalem, and crushed the movement in an afternoon. But they didn't, because they couldn't. Finally, Section 6. The best historical explanation. It's time to reach a verdict. Ultimately, it all comes down to explanatory power. You know the old saying, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however unlikely, must be the truth. The physical bodily resurrection of Jesus is literally the only hypothesis that accounts for all 5 of those minimal facts simultaneously. It explains the empty tomb, the appearances, the medical reality of the death, and the phenomenal, completely unexpected conversions of skeptics like Paul and James. And it does all of this without contradicting modern medical or psychological science. And just think about the historical ripple effects. We see a massive cultural paradigm shift. Thousands of devout first-century Jews suddenly, almost overnight, abandoned their deeply sacred Saturday Sabbath to worship on Sunday, the exact day they claimed the resurrection happened. The movement exploded right there in Jerusalem, which is the exact city where anyone could have just walked over and checked the tomb for themselves. And the public preaching of this event was strategically delayed exactly 50 days until Pentecost. That proves this wasn't just some frenzied mob fabricating a quick hoax. They waited. These massive cultural shifts demand a catalyst of truly monumental proportions. So, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If the medical data proves he actually died, if the tomb was verifiably empty, and if hardened, hostile skeptics were suddenly transformed into joyful martyrs who changed the world, what is your historical explanation? The evidence is all right there on the table, so what verdict will you reach? Thanks so much for joining me today.